I've been meaning to do a more chronological thing out of the Windows games episodes for my nostalgia trip games, despite the first episode being a bit all over the place. This long overdue third episode for Windows 95 and 98, and possibly up to XP, starts with one of the currently less spoken of icons from Microsoft itself, Hover, from 1995. It's not a game I actually played all that much, and I wasn't that impressed by it either. But seeing it now, after over 25 years since seeing it last, it brings such a nostalgic feel as I couldn't have ever expected. Mostly about a couple of people who knew about it and showed the game to me originally, who I'm not sure are even alive anymore. In any case, Hover was originally released on the CD-ROM versions of Windows 95, showcasing the new operating system's capabilities, which is most likely the reason how I got to play this game in the first place. I just never had a Windows 95 myself, and wasn't particularly impressed by the operating system's abilities then. Hover is basically a first-person capture-the-flag sort of a thing, played with hovering bumper cars, and your hovercraft can collect items to give you various kinds of effects, such as speed increase or decrease, and temporary invisibility. With only 3 areas and a single-player mode, it doesn't have much of longevity, but it was rather novel at the time of release and quite unique up until first-person shooters with more multiplayer play modes than Deathmatch started utilizing vehicles such as Mobile Forces and Battlefield 1942, both of which were still years away from Hover. Of course, because Hover eventually became kind of obsolete, Microsoft eventually remastered the game for web browsers and handheld devices, with the ability to play with touchscreens even, as well as in an actual multiplayer session with up to 8 players on a server. But the original Hover can now be found through the Internet Archive, so head on there if you want to have a nostalgia trip you didn't know you needed. Now let's skip to 1997 and enjoy a lesser-known Finnish game from Housemarque. The game in question is a diagonal shooter called The Reap. If you've never heard of The Reap and are seeing it now for the first time, I would hazard a guess the first thing that crosses your mind is the Sega arcade classic Zaxxon. Well, to be fair, that was my initial thought as well when I saw The Reap for the first time, but you don't really need to play it for more than a minute or two to see the Zaxxon reference barely scratches the surface here. Although there's definitely a considerable difficulty curve in The Reap, it's not quite a bullet hell game, although it's not far from it. I suspect though that it took some inspiration from the subgenre of shooters that started in the mid-90s. I have never gotten too far in the game, but it's always a fun and uncommon experience to revisit. The Reap had been in my purchase list ever since I first read about it in 1997, and it took me 25 years to finally buy it from an online gaming store. Prior to this, I had only ever played a very limited playable demo version included in some sort of a magazine CD-ROM, which explains the nostalgia factor for me quite strongly. But getting to play the full game was a long time coming, and if it wasn't quite worth the wait, I'd be the last person to admit it.
Hey Bonnet, what is this? Just wait, something cool's gonna happen.
Now, Beavis and Butthead in Virtual Stupidity was one of my most anticipated adventure game experiences in my youth. Not only because I was a fan of both Beavis and Butthead as well as adventure games in general, but Virtual Stupidity was, for a closet anarchistic teenager like myself, a way to think as stupidly as possible and enjoy the misadventures of 2 of possibly the most mentally challenged cartoon characters of all time by controlling them. The main quest in Virtual Stupidity is about Beavis and Butthead trying to join Todd's gang because Todd is cool. Although the gameplay is remarkably close to classic LucasArts adventures like Sam & Max Hit the Road and such. What makes Virtual Stupidity particularly entertaining to play is the occasional arcade and minigames, hidden music videos, the pixel-perfect graphics, and voice acting by Mike Judge himself, among others.
Okay. Check it out, Butthead. This is my wood. No way.
In other words, this is one of the rare occasions of a perfectly executed TV licensed game.
Let me show you.
Beavis and Butthead in Virtual Stupidity was released for Windows PCs and the first PlayStation in 1995.
What the hell? What are you kids doing
And it's
up there?
practically impossible to find these days in any legal form unless you're willing to lay down over $100 for a full boxed version on eBay. Let's hope GOG.com is able to distribute it at some point in the future. For some odd reason, the game that really made me want to upgrade from Windows 3.11 to Windows 98 was the special edition of Need for Speed 2. I got to play this game on one of my friend's PCs, and because I was already a huge fan of the first Need for Speed, which I managed to play on my own PC because it was a DOS game, I had to get myself a newer Windows so I could play the sequel as well. The special edition was the version that circulated around in my area, so I never actually played the original version. While the gameplay and graphics had definitely upgraded from the first game, I was a bit disappointed in the fact that there were no road segments that would take you from point A to point B like there were in the first game. But some of the new tracks were quite fun to drive around, as were some of the cars in the game. This game also changed the way I played the Need for Speed games from this point on, because the first game always felt like it was the most natural to play from behind the wheel, but the more wildly winding roads and faster action in NFS2 made it more comfortable to drive from a third-person view. Need for Speed would later become a massively successful series with more sequels than I can count, eventually becoming such a mass-market thing that I couldn't be bothered with the newer games. But the first 3, well, maybe 4 games, are still very nostalgic to me, and each of them do get a revisit every few years. One of the last fresh strategy games that I bothered with was a World War II themed real-time tactics game called Commandos Behind Enemy Lines, released by Eidos in 1998. It was a surprise hit for a Spanish developing company Pyro Studios, whose first game this was, and remained their only successful franchise until their disbanding in 2017. In Commandos, you control a group of 6 allied commandos through 20 missions in Europe and Africa, with missions varying from sabotage to rescue missions and such. Each mission can be planned prior to the execution of the plan, and is certainly recommendable to be done so because all your commandos have different skills, such as diving, climbing, sniping, and stealth.
That's easy.
The excellent gameplay is enhanced with great graphics and a superb cast of voice actors, as well as real World War II footage as full-motion video clips between missions.
Righto, sir.
Even though Commandos is already 24 years old, it still looks and feels as great as when it was first published. Its legacy not only includes 3 sequels, but also a disconnected clone series based in the Old West called Desperados. If you're into this kind of stealth gaming, there's a lot of it to be had, and they're all available at GOG.com and Steam.
Okay. Yep.